Chapter 4: The Makati Lifestyle. Nearly 6 months after the rainy night at the Manila International Container Port, the first thing Mateo Reyes noticed about Makati was the silence. It was not the peaceful, organic silence of the distant provinces, nor was it the heavy, breathless quiet that fell over Tonda just before a police raid. Manila itself never truly slept. But this was the heavily engineered, guarded silence of extreme wealth. Standing on the balcony of his new condominium on the 32nd floor, Mateo looked down at the sprawling metropolis that had once threatened to swallow him whole. Down in the streets of Tonda, the air was a suffocating soup of frying oil, open sewage, and desperation, lit by the flickering orange glow of dying street lamps. Up here, the air tasted different. It was crisp. It smelled of expensive cologne, ozone, and the ever-present hum of industrial air conditioning. The wide, immaculate streets below were lined with towering glass monoliths that reached toward the night sky like monuments built by modern gods. But earlier that morning, Mateo had seen the front page of the local papers. A 14-year-old boy in Tonda had been found dead in an alley, having overdosed on the new, highly potent synthetic product Mateo's network had flooded into the slums. The photo showed the boy lying discarded near a pile of pag, recycled meat from the trash. Mateo had stared at the photo, realizing his money had placed that boy in the dirt. For a dizzying, sickening moment, Mateo had picked up his phone, ready to call June and order an absolute halt to all Tonda distribution. He had almost thrown it all away. Then, he had stopped himself, rationalizing that if he didn't sell it, Alves would. It wasn't his fault. But the dead boy's face lingered in his mind. But earlier that morning, Mateo had seen the front page of the local papers. A 14-year-old boy in Tonda had been found dead in an alley, having overdosed on the new, highly potent synthetic product Mateo's network had flooded into the slums. The photo showed the boy lying discarded near a pile of pag, recycled meat from the trash. Mateo had stared at the photo, realizing his money had placed that boy in the dirt. For a dizzying, sickening moment, Mateo had picked up his phone, ready to call June and order an absolute halt to all Tonda distribution. He had almost thrown it all away. Then, he had stopped himself, rationalizing that if he didn't sell it, Alves would. It wasn't his fault. But the dead boy's face lingered in his mind. Far below him, the late-night traffic crawled smoothly along Ayala Avenue, forming a continuous, glowing river of red taillights and brilliant white headlights. Behind him, the penthouse suite was a cavernous expanse of polished Italian marble floors, floor-to-ceiling soundproof windows, and minimalist leather furniture so absurdly expensive that Mateo had honestly been afraid to sit on it during his first night. He still woke up sometimes in the dead of the night, his heart hammering against his ribs, his nose expecting to catch the scent of burning garbage and wet rust. His hand would instinctively reach for a hunting knife that was no longer tucked under his mattress. He had moved his mother to a quiet, guarded neighborhood in a distant southern province 2 months ago, permanently away from the blood and the noise of the city. He rarely called her, terrified that his dark new reality would somehow bleed through the phone, but the anonymous monthly cash transfers ensured she would never be forced to touch a dirty stove again. She had effectively disappeared from his daily existence, becoming just another memory he locked away. In the early weeks following Salazar's execution, Mateo had barely slept. He had spent hours scrubbing his hands in the sink, haunted by the phantom scent of spent brass and copper. But survival in Marco's orbit demanded a psychological armor he hadn't possessed in the slums. Every time he ordered an extortion beating or collected a bribe, Mateo deliberately chose to bury the lingering horror beneath a thick layer of ice. The agonizing guilt had predictably fractured, then calloused, and finally calcified into a necessary numbness. He had systematically taught himself to shut his empathy off. Mateo lifted a heavy crystal glass of imported single-malt whiskey to his lips. He took a slow sip, letting the amber liquid burn pleasantly down his throat as he watched the glittering skyline. "Not bad for a street kid from the slums," Marco Dizon said, his voice cutting through the quiet of the apartment. Mateo turned his head slightly. Marco was leaning casually against the granite kitchen counter. He was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Mateo had earned in his entire first year running crushed pills for the Ascals. Marco looked in his element, surrounded by the trappings of upper-class Manila. Mateo offered a thin, humorless smirk. "You like it?" Marco pushed off the counter and walked slowly toward the window, looking down at the city with an expression of deep satisfaction. "I like that the narcotics police can't kick your front door down here without passing through a gated checkpoint, 3 security desks, 2 sets of biometric locks, and high-definition cameras seeing them coming 5 minutes in advance." Mateo laughed dryly, the sound devoid of real warmth. "That too." But as Mateo well knew, the luxury condominium wasn't simply about finding a comfortable place to sleep. It was about strategic transformation. It was camouflage. Nobody asked dangerous questions when you lived in the heart of Makati. Security guards opened doors for you. Concierges smiled and nodded rapidly when you walked past. Nobody suspected that the young, sharp-eyed man stepping out of the private elevator wearing a heavy gold Rolex and Italian leather shoes had murdered a cartel boss a few months prior. Especially not when he looked like he belonged there. But the luxury was not a shield, it was a magnet. Just yesterday, Mateo had to smoothly navigate a tense, deeply unpleasant lunch with a notoriously corrupt district senator who heavily hinted at wanting a piece of their new casino operations. And twice already this week, June Street lieutenants had reported unknown Southern scouts aggressively probing the edges of their distribution lines in Maylate. The money was endless, but the target on his back was growing rapidly by the hour. "Mr. Reyes, you have a guest," the polite voice said through the speaker. "He says his name is June." Mateo blinked, slightly caught off guard. "Send him up." A few minutes later, the private elevator chimed softly. The polished steel doors slid open, and June stepped nervously onto the imported Italian marble floor. He looked wildly out of place. He was wearing faded, oversized denim jeans, scuffed sneakers, and a plain white t-shirt that had seen too many rough washes. His hair was cut short, his knuckles were permanently scarred from years of alley brawls, and his dark eyes darted suspiciously around the empty space of the penthouse. "Holy shit, Teo," June breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't step further than 3 feet onto the marble, as if he were afraid his dirty shoes would stain it. He looked up at the towering glass windows and the glittering skyline. "Is this real?" Mateo set his whiskey glass down on the granite counter and walked over, clapping his oldest friend firmly on the shoulder. "It's real, June. Have a drink." June didn't move toward the bar. He just kept staring around the room, his expression caught somewhere between deep awe and profound discomfort. "The boys back at the basketball court, they're saying you met with Marco Dizon. They're saying you're pushing 20 kilos a week now. From the ports." Mateo nodded slowly. "We're expanding." June finally looked at Mateo, really looked at him. He took in the tailored pants, the crisp collared shirt, the heavy gold Rolex wrapped around Mateo's wrist. The wedge of new wealth hung in the air-conditioned space between them. "Expanding," June repeated softly. He pulled his hands from his empty pockets, gesturing vaguely at the skyline. "They're talking about Marco Dizon's money, Teo. I want my piece. I want one of those imported sports cars. A red Porsche. Something loud. I grew up with nothing in the dirt, and I want them to see we finally made it." Mateo's face hardened. He stepped closer to June, his voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. "No." June blinked, surprised. "Why not?" "Because visibility is a trap," Mateo said, tapping a finger against June's chest. "You buy a red Porsche, you're not proving you made it. You're painting a target on your back for the NBI and the rival cartels. Look at Marco's old partners. Dead or in prison. Kings that show themselves get killed, June. I didn't abandon you in Tonda, but I need you to stay a ghost if you want to survive this." June swallowed hard, the resentment giving way to a grudging, tragic loyalty. He believed Mateo was the only man who had never abandoned him, the only one who had dragged him out of the starvation of the dumps. Down in Tonda, it doesn't feel like expanding, Teo, June continued softly, changing the subject. It feels like waiting. We got guys holding street corners who haven't seen your face in a month. They see me, but they don't see you. People are starting to whisper. Mateo's jaw tightened. Tell them to look at their weekly cuts. They're getting paid triple what Salazar ever gave them. If they want to whisper about that, they can come tell it to my face. June let out a short, nervous laugh, shaking his head. They can't come to your face, Teo. Look at this place. A kid from Dagupan Street wouldn't even make it past the front gate of this building without getting arrested. June took a small step backward toward the waiting elevator. I just came to drop off the weekly ledger from the Binondo route. It's in the mailroom downstairs. I didn't want to bring it up here and get it dirty. Before Mateo could say anything, June pressed the down arrow. Stay sharp up here, boss, June said quietly as the steel doors slid shut. Air gets pretty thin in the clouds. Mateo stood alone in the grand hallway long after the elevator had descended. The heavy crystal glass of whiskey felt uncomfortably heavy in his hand. However, the rapid influx of wealth brought a new category of problems. The first harsh lesson Mateo learned after the port shipment started flowing was that physical cash was dangerous. Street-level drug dealers loved cash. They fought over it, bled for it, and died for it. But legitimate banks hated it. And the government closely watched it. When Mateo had been a street boss in Tonda, handling a few 100,000 pesos a week was simple. He kept it in duffel bags under floorboards. But moving 20 tightly packed kilos of pure product through the Manila International Container Port every single week generated a staggering, terrifying volume of paper currency. You couldn't simply walk into a branch of the Bank of the Philippine Islands with a trash bag containing 15 million pesos in crumpled bills and ask to open a checking account. To solve the most dangerous bottleneck in their growing empire, Marco introduced him to a man named Victor Tan. Victor was a quiet, unassuming man in his late 50s. He wore simple wire-rimmed glasses, inexpensive slacks, and possessed the calm, measured voice of an accountant who had spent his entire adult life making very large problems disappear for very powerful men. To the outside world, Victor Tan owned 3 mundane, seemingly disconnected businesses scattered across the edges of Makati and Pasay, a mid-sized freight logistics company, a perpetually crowded neon-lit karaoke bar, and a commercial laundry service that processed hundreds of kilos of hotel and hospital linens every single day. They met late on a Tuesday night on the thundering factory floor of the commercial laundry facility in Pasay. The air inside the warehouse was suffocatingly hot, thick with swirling, scented steam and the deafening roar of 20 industrial-sized washing machines spinning continuously. Dozens of exhausted workers in white aprons pushed heavy canvas carts filled with damp linens down narrow concrete aisles. Victor Tan walked briskly through the steam, unaffected by the extreme heat, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the relentless grinding of the machinery. You simply cannot inject millions of undocumented pesos into the formal banking sector without providing a comprehensive explanation. Victor shouted, stepping smoothly out of the way as a forklift rumbled past them carrying pallets of industrial detergent. The Anti-Money Laundering Council relies heavily on automated algorithms. Sudden spikes in cash deposits trigger immediate, catastrophic audits. Mateo walked closely behind him, keeping his eye on the heavy, rotating drums. So what exactly do we do with the mountain of paper sitting in my safe houses? Victor stopped walking and gestured proudly toward the line of roaring washing machines. We clean it, Mr. Reyes. He pulled a folded tablet from his breast pocket and tapped the screen, bringing up a complex digital spreadsheet. Your illicit cash slowly becomes legitimate business revenue, Victor yelled over the hissing of a steam press. Mateo squinted through the humid air at the glowing screen. Revenue from washing hotel sheets. Victor chuckled, a dry sound instantly swallowed by the factory noise. From many overlapping things. Diversification is the key to financial camouflage. He pointed sharply at the rumbling washing machines. Your illicit shipments moving through the port. We officially mark them on the books as domestic freight logistics for this very facility. We create fake invoices for clients who solely deal in cash. The karaoke bar downtown. We consistently report high nightly revenue, inflating the bar tabs and fabricating VIP room bookings. This laundry service right here. It officially processes thousands of uniforms for phantom construction companies across Manila. Mateo nodded slowly, his analytical mind easily grasping the elegant mechanics of the system despite the chaotic environment. And the physical cash itself? Victor began walking again, leading them toward the loading docks where delivery trucks were idling loudly in the night air. It enters the formal system slowly. Always slowly. Drip by drip. It is meticulously deposited across 30 different bank accounts in small, randomized amounts that always fall safely below the 500,000 peso reporting threshold. Once it enters the accounts, it is taxed, transferred, and consolidated. Marco, walking on Mateo's left, grinned broadly, his face sweating in the stifling heat. You're a legitimate businessman now, Mateo. A captain of industry. Mateo looked back at the spinning metal drums churning endless cycles of filthy laundry into clean, folded profit. Millions of pesos moving quietly through legitimate, deeply boring corporate accounts. It was clean. It was formally taxed by the government. It was untouchable. For the very first time in his life, feeling the heat of the factory floor, the money finally felt real. It wasn't just survival money anymore. It was generational wealth. But extreme wealth in Manila didn't just belong to gangsters and businessmen. True, unquestionable power belonged to the politicians. And politicians, Mateo quickly learned, loved untraceable money more than anyone else in the city. A month after the laundering network was established, Marco arranged a highly sensitive meeting at an exclusive, members-only restaurant overlooking the dark waters of Manila Bay. Mateo wore his best suit. As they sat on the private terrace, the vibrant sunset burned brilliant shades of orange and bruised purple across the horizon. A dozen multi-million peso luxury yachts rocked gently in the harbor below, their pristine white hulls glowing under the dock lights. A few minutes later, surrounded by two stone-faced private security contractors, an older man approached their table. He wore an immaculate barong Tagalog and a smile that was polished to a terrifying gleam, though the warmth never quite reached his calculating eyes. It was Senator Gabriel Velasco. He was one of the most visible and heavily entrenched political power brokers in the entire metropolitan area. He possessed a wet, rattling cough from a lifetime of chain-smoking imported Cuban cigars, but he spoke with the soft, patient cadence of a rural Catholic priest, a terrifying combination that made his extortion sound like religious salvation. The senator extended a manicured hand. "I've heard you are becoming a very successful young man, Mr. Reyes." Mateo stood and shook the man's hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. "I just focus on my business, Senator." Velasco smiled knowingly, taking the seat at the head of the table. His bodyguards stepped back, giving them the illusion of privacy while keeping watch over the terrace. "Yes, of course. Business." The senator casually ordered a bottle of imported French wine that cost significantly more than Mateo's mother had once made in an entire year of backbreaking labor. When the waiter swiftly poured the wine and retreated into the restaurant, Velasco leaned forward, dropping the affable politician persona. "You move substantial goods through the international port," Velasco stated. It wasn't framed as a question. It was an established fact. Mateo said nothing, keeping his face neutral. Velasco took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes locked onto Mateo's. "The Customs Department is a labyrinth, Mr. Reyes. But ultimately, the people running that labyrinth answer to certain higher authorities." Marco leaned heavily onto the table. "And those authorities answer directly to you?" Velasco laughed softly, the sound barely rising above the gentle crashing of the waves against the seawall. "Let's simply say that, when necessary, I possess the unique ability to make heavily stamped paperwork disappear. I can ensure that certain ambitious police task forces are permanently redirected towards solving other, less profitable crimes. Mateo understood the dynamic immediately. This was an extortion attempt. It was elegantly dressed in a tailored shirt and holding an expensive glass of wine, but it was exactly the same as a street gang demanding a cut of a corner dealer's daily earnings. It was protection money. Political protection. But nothing in Manila came for free, and Mateo knew better than to negotiate with a man who could end his entire operation with a single phone call to the chief of police. Mateo tapped his finger against the stem of his wine glass. How expensive are your upcoming campaigns, Senator? The politician's smile widened just a fraction of an inch. Elections in this country are remarkably expensive, Mateo. The people demand to be entertained. They demand generosity. I estimate I will need roughly 10 million pesos to ensure the next election is secure. Mateo didn't blink. He didn't flinch at the staggering number. Instead, he leaned forward, closing the distance between them. That volume of support can easily be arranged, Mateo said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping comfortably back into his street rhythm. But if I am paying for your seat in the Senate, I expect a tangible return on my investment. Velasco's smile faltered slightly. He clearly wasn't used to street kids attempting to negotiate. I already promised you protection, Mr. Reyes. I don't just want protection, Mateo said flatly. I want a weapon. If a rival syndicate moves into the port, I want the customs department to freeze their shipments permanently. If a rival gang steps onto my streets in Tonda, I want your ambitious police task forces accidentally raiding their warehouses the very next night. Mateo took a slow sip of his own wine, letting his dark eyes lock onto the older man's. I'll give you 10 million for the campaign, Senator. But when I call, you answer the phone. Do we understand each other? Velasco stared at the young man, a mixture of mild insult and genuine, begrudging respect flickering across his polished face. He reached out and raised his glass in a tense, silent toast. Then I am certain we will be very, very good friends. A duffel bag of dirty street cash was useless for bribing a man like Gabriel Velasco. The senator had demanded a legal campaign donation routed into his political shell companies, which meant dirty money had to become clean, documented equity. To wash 10 million pesos that quickly, they needed a much faster, much larger machine. By the time Mateo stepped onto the main floor of the sprawling Entertainment City Casino along Manila Bay, he was wearing a handmade charcoal suit tailored in Hong Kong and a platinum watch that could have easily purchased an entire residential block in the slums of Tonda. The casino floor glowed offensively bright, like a modern, neon-lit palace. Massive, glittering gold chandeliers hung suspended from the impossibly high, painted ceilings. The heavily air-conditioned air smelled strongly of expensive Cuban cigars, heavy floral perfumes, and the sharp, metallic tang of unadulterated greed. Outside the towering, blast-proof glass windows, the dark waters of Manila Bay shimmered under the city lights. Inside, the ambient sound was deeply hypnotic. The sharp clinking of heavy clay chips. The mesmerizing, repetitive rattle of roulette wheels spinning under strobing multicolored lights. The soft, elegant sliding of cards across pristine green felt tables. Beautiful, statuesque women wearing identical black velvet dresses drifted silently between groups of shouting, wealthy gamblers. Mateo had never experienced anything quite like it. It was a sensory overload of neon and velvet. The sheer volume of money casually changing hands every single second was dizzying. Marco leaned close, cutting through his distraction. Look closely at the players, Mateo. Don't look at the lights. Look at who is holding the chips. Mateo scanned the room. His eyes locked onto a man in a rumpled silk jacket laughing loudly at a craps table, tossing a handful of high-denomination yellow chips. That's Congressman Bautista, Marco whispered directly into his ear. He's currently gambling a construction kickback. And over there, at the high-limit blackjack table, that's a regional police director miraculously winning a prearranged jackpot. Mateo slowly absorbed the reality of the room. The glittering casino wasn't a place of chance. It was a sophisticated machine designed to turn dirty money into legal miracles. Mateo walked over to the VIP cashier's cage. He didn't hand over a bank card. He unzipped a heavy, black canvas duffel bag stuffed with street-level 100,000 peso bills. The teller didn't blink. The machine quietly counted the dirty money, and 10 minutes later, Mateo was handed a tray of pristine, high-denomination clay chips. 3 million pesos. Mateo carried the heavy tray to an empty spot near a roped-off baccarat table. He sat down, signaling a waitress for a drink. "How fast does this machine run?" Marco smiled grimly, taking a seat behind him. "As fast as you can lose." The dealer, a sharply dressed man with robotic precision, slid the cards smoothly across the table. Mateo calmly pulled a stack of chips forward and placed his first bet. 500,000 pesos. The wealthy real estate developer sitting next to him let out a low, impressed whistle. The dealer turned the cards over. Mateo lost immediately. He offered a subtle shrug, betraying no emotion whatsoever, and placed another bet. Another sudden loss. He bet again. And again. Within an hour of sitting at the table, Mateo had systematically, intentionally lost nearly 3 million pesos. But Marco, standing quietly behind him, didn't look the least bit worried. Instead, a man in a sharp navy blue suit approached their table. His name tag identified him as an executive casino host. "Mr. Reyes," the host said, his voice dripping with practiced, hyper-polite deference. Mateo looked up from his dwindling stack of chips. "Yes. We deeply appreciate your extensive business with us tonight." Mateo nodded slowly. "It's been an interesting evening." The host leaned closer, lowering his voice so the other gamblers couldn't hear. "Sir, given your level of play, would you care to visit one of our private VIP rooms? We have special accommodations for our high-volume guests." Marco immediately stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "That sounds perfect." The VIP room was a different world from the chaotic main floor. It was silent. Deeply private. The thick, plush carpets muted every single footstep. There were no flashing lights, no ringing slot machines, and no cheering crowds. A single man waited for them inside the room. He was an older Chinese national wearing a razor-sharp, flawless black suit. His left hand rested on the table, missing the pinky and ring fingers, a violent, permanent reminder from his days as a triad accountant in Macau about what happens when ledgers are miscalculated. Because of his missing fingers, his movements were strangely delicate, and his eyes were devoid of any warmth or theatricality. He introduced himself simply as Mr. Liu. They sat down around a small, polished mahogany table while a silent waitress discreetly poured 3 glasses of top-shelf whiskey before vanishing from the room, securely closing the heavy oak doors behind her. Mr. Liu spoke softly, his English heavily accented but deliberate. "You lost 3 million pesos on the main floor tonight, Mr. Reyes." Mateo nodded, taking a sip of the whiskey. "Luck. It happens." Mr. Liu smiled slightly, revealing straight teeth. "Not always." Marco leaned forward, placing his elbows on the mahogany table. "Let's stop the theater and talk actual business." Mr. Liu folded his hands smoothly in his lap. "The casino system officially records and reports your total losses as legitimate gambling activity." Mateo's mind raced ahead, piecing the mechanics together immediately. "And?" Mr. Liu continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "You bought into the game using cash through my specific junket. Because you are a valued VIP, our junket returns 70% of those losses to you. We wire that clean, legally documented dividend directly into whatever offshore corporate account you designate." Mateo raised a single eyebrow. Marco grinned. "Congratulations. You just washed 2 million pesos and routed it straight to the Senator's Political Action Committee in under an hour." Mateo didn't smile back. He did the rapid math in his head. The numbers soured his mood. 30%. That's an offensive cut, Mr. Liu. The street rate for blind money washing is 20%, max. You are actively robbing me. Mr. Liu didn't lose his calm composure, but the room temperature seemed to drop. We are not a dirty street corner in Binondo, Mr. Reyes. This is an internationally recognized financial institution. The extra 10% ensures your money is legally fortified in international accounts. You are paying for the bulletproof guarantee that the government will never build a case against you. Mateo leaned forward, resting his powerful forearms on the mahogany table. He had just handed this man 1,000,000 pesos in pure profit. And I am about to bring you 10 million pesos in dirty street cash by the end of the week. Another 10 million the week after that. Mr. Liu's eyes widened a fraction of a millimeter. That type of consistent volume rivaled the mainland syndicates. If you want that immense volume walking through your front doors, Mateo said softly, his voice echoing off the paneled walls, the premium drops to 22%. Right now. Mr. Liu studied the young, sharply dressed gangster for a long, quiet moment. He was accurately calculating the long-term profit of the relationship versus the short-term loss of his margin. Slowly, Mr. Liu gave a single, respectful nod. 22%. You drive a brutal bargain for a supposedly lucky gambler, Mr. Reyes. Mateo leaned back deeply into his plush leather chair, finally smiling. I find that luck almost always favors the brutal. But excessive luck, success, and sudden wealth inevitably created heavy attention. And in the Manila underworld, attention rapidly created violent enemies. 3 weeks after successfully clearing the final payments for Senator Velasco, Mateo sat alone on the balcony of his penthouse, drinking his black coffee and enjoying the high-altitude morning breeze. He had left his phone inside on purpose, craving 30 minutes of profound silence. As he looked out across the sprawling cityscape, his eyes automatically drifted downward toward the streets immediately surrounding his luxury building. Old habits from the slums refused to die. Yesterday morning, he had spotted a faded gray Mitsubishi utility van parked illegally near the secondary service entrance of the building. It had been sitting there for 3 uninterrupted hours. Today, as Mateo leaned over the glass railing 32 stories up, he quickly spotted the exact same van. Right now, it was parked across the busy street, positioned to monitor the front gates of his guarded complex. A cold spike of adrenaline slammed directly into Mateo's bloodstream. The beautiful morning air instantly lost its charm. His instincts screamed that the pristine bubble of Makati had finally been silently breached. He stood up, his coffee forgotten, when Marco walked into the penthouse suite without knocking. His usual calm, arrogant demeanor was gone. His expression was dead serious. "We have a severe problem," Marco announced. Mateo didn't even turn around. He just kept staring down at the tiny, distant gray van. "I know." Marco blinked in surprise. "You know." Mateo finally turned away from the glass railing. "Someone's currently watching the front gate." Gray Mitsubishi van. Same exact vehicle was parked by the rear loading dock yesterday morning. Marco quickly tossed a thick manila folder onto the coffee table. Dozens of printed photographs slid out across the glass. They were grainy, long-lens surveillance pictures. There were photos of the loading docks at the port. Photos of Mateo's exact condominium building in Makati. Photos of Victor Tan stepping out of the karaoke bar. Mateo picked up one of the photos, staring at the blurry figures of hardened men sitting inside a gray Mitsubishi van taking the pictures. His blood immediately ran cold. "Who the hell are they?" Mateo demanded, his voice dropping into a deadly register. Marco answered quietly, fear finally bleeding into his tone. "The Devo Group." Mateo frowned, his mind furiously searching his knowledge of the country's syndicates. They were another cartel, deeply entrenched in the lawless southern islands of Mindanao. They were notorious for using ex-military mercenaries as enforcers. They're aggressively expanding their operations north, Marco explained, pointing at the photos. And word on the streets is that they think the entire Manila port system rightfully belongs to them now. Mateo stared silently out at the sprawling, glittering skyline of the city again. The millions of city lights flickered in the smog like trapped stars. Just a week ago, sitting in the VIP room of the casino, he had felt untouchable. He felt like he had finally beaten the system. Now, the entire board was changing. The rules were shifting. Marco lit a cigarette with shaking hands, taking a deep, desperate drag. "You're not just a street dealer fighting over Tonda anymore, Mateo." Mateo turned slowly from the window toward his partner. "What am I then?" Marco smiled, a grim, bloodless expression. "You're the king. Which means you are officially the primary target." Mateo finished his coffee and walked over to the bedroom. He didn't say a word as he reached under the mattress and pulled out the heavy, cold steel of his hunting knife and his loaded pistol. Every ounce of his expensive, tailored Makati lifestyle stripped away, leaving only the hardened, vicious survivor from the slums. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the beautiful lights of Manila Bay shimmered peacefully. Inside the quiet penthouse, a brutal war was just beginning. And the boy from Tonda was about to learn the hardest lesson of all: power in Manila always came with a heavy price.